When the HOA president, Karen, burst into my secluded valley cabin demanding to inspect the place, she had no idea who was sitting across the table from me. She slammed the door open, waving her clipboard, shouting about unauthorized structures and violations, completely ignoring the tall man in a dark suit sipping his coffee quietly. What she didn't know, what made my blood run cold and her fate sealed, was that the man was the state attorney general himself. That cabin wasn't just my weekend retreat. It was the site of a private legal meeting about HOA corruption in the state. Karen had just stormed into a confidential government session without permission, violating more laws than she could count. And when the attorney general calmly asked for her name, the color drained from her face. She thought she was above the rules until she met the man who wrote them. The valley was quiet that morning. The kind of peaceful silence that only deep woods can hold. Mist clung to the treetops like a soft gray blanket, and the faint rush of the creek below the ridge played its steady tune. My old cabin stood there, tucked between two tall pines, a place I'd built long before anyone even thought of calling this land part of a community. Back then, it was just open country, a piece of earth where a man could breathe. Now, it sat just a few hundred feet outside the border of Valley Estates, the neighborhood that gave rise to one of the most controlling HOAs in the state, led by none other than Karen Blake. Karen had become a local legend for all the wrong reasons. If you parked an inch over the painted line, she'd send a warning. If you forgot to mow your lawn for a week, a fine would appear in your mailbox. I'd heard stories of her knocking on doors in the middle of dinner to remind homeowners of HOA decorum. She didn't just enforce the rules, she created them, stretched them, twisted them, until they gave her control over everything and everyone. I'd managed to stay mostly out of her reach because my cabin sat on land. My father left Milan clearly marked outside the HOA map, but that didn't stop her from trying to pull me into her little empire. That morning, the cabin smelled like fresh coffee and cedar. Papers were spread across the old wooden table, legal documents, property maps, and a thick folder labeled State Review, HOA Violations. Sitting across from me was a tall man in a gray suit, his expression calm but focused. "You've gathered quite the file here, Mr. Walker," said Benjamin Benson, the state attorney general. His voice had that steady authority of someone used to courtrooms and microphones. But his eyes showed something more wariness, perhaps. "If half of this is true," he continued, flipping through pages, "this HOA isn't just overstepping, they're breaking multiple state laws." I nodded. "That's why I asked you to come here instead of the city," I said. "Too many eyes in Valley Estates. Karen has people watching everything, even my mailbox." Benson gave a short nod of understanding. "Smart move. Quiet location. No distractions." He took a sip of his coffee and leaned back. "I'll admit, though, it's not every day the Attorney General holds a meeting in a cabin in the woods." I smiled. "Sometimes justice needs a little fresh air." Outside, a light breeze rustled through the pines. The cabin creaked softly, old but sturdy. I could feel the calm before something big, like the stillness before a storm. Benson started outlining the next steps, reviewing financial records, comparing HOA policies with state regulations, and interviewing affected homeowners. We were deep into discussing the forged maintenance contracts when the sound of a distant engine cut through the peace. It started faint, then grew louder, gravel crunching under heavy tires. Benson paused mid-sentence, raising an eyebrow. "Expecting anyone?" he asked. "No," I said slowly, standing up. "Nobody knows we're here." The engine stopped right outside. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of a familiar white SUV with Valley Estates HOA printed on the door in fancy letters. My stomach dropped. Before I could move, the cabin door flew open so hard it slammed against the wall. Standing there, red-faced and furious, was Karen Blake herself. "There you are," she snapped, storming inside without a word of greeting. "I've been looking for you, Mr. Walker. Do you have any idea how many violations you've racked up?" Her voice bounced off the wooden walls, sharp and intrusive. She was dressed in her usual HOA uniform, pressed khakis, a bright blue blouse, and that clipboard she treated like a royal scepter. "Karen," I began carefully, "you can't just barge in here." "I most certainly can," she interrupted, marching toward the table. "This structure, this cabin, wasn't approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. There are no permits filed, no inspection reports, and rumor has it you've even been conducting meetings here without authorization." I felt Benson stand behind me, quiet but watchful. "Karen," I said again, firmer this time, "you're out of line. This property isn't part of Valley Estates." She spun toward me, eyes flashing. "Everything within a half-mile radius of our community is under our oversight," she said. "You can't just hide from regulations by claiming you're outside the border. That's not how it works." Benson's voice broke the tension like a blade slicing through fabric. "Actually," he said calmly, "that's exactly how it works." Karen turned, finally noticing him for the first time. Her eyes flicked over the suit, the briefcase, the open folder of legal documents, but she didn't seem to register the danger. "And who might you be?" she demanded, crossing her arms. Benson met her glare without blinking. "Benjamin Benson, State Attorney General." The silence that followed was thick. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since she entered, she looked uncertain. I didn't realize, she stammered. I was just following up on community standards. Benson set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. You entered private property without consent, he said evenly. That's trespassing. And you interrupted a state-level meeting under investigation confidentiality. That's a serious offense. Karen's face turned pale. She looked at me, searching for help, but I said nothing. The truth was, I'd warned her more than once to stave off this land. Benson pulled out a small notepad and jotted something down. What's your full name? He asked Karen Blake. She said softly, President of the Valley Estates HOA. He nodded once. Thank you, Ms. Blake. I'll make sure your presence here is noted in our report. Karen looked like she wanted to disappear. She muttered something about a misunderstanding, then hurried out of the cabin, her SUV tires kicking up gravel as she sped down the road. When the dust settled, Benson looked at me with a half smile. You weren't kidding about her, he said. I chuckled. That was her being polite. But inside, I knew if this was just the beginning. Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the storm she'd just started was about to change everything in Valley Estates. The days following Karen's outburst at my cabin were oddly quiet, too quiet for Valley Estates. Normally, rumors spread like wildfire there. You couldn't sneeze without someone posting about it on the community board. But after her little visit to the cabin, everything went silent. No HOA emails, no reminders about lawn heights or mailbox paint. Not even the usual gossip about who parked where. It was the kind of stillness that meant something was brewing underneath. I spent most of that week reviewing the reports Benson left behind. He had promised to begin a formal review of the HOA's operations, its spending, election records, complaint procedures, and those mysterious emergency maintenance fees Karen kept inventing. The documents I'd gathered over months were finally in the right hands. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. People like her didn't retreat quietly, they regrouped. 3 days later, that suspicion proved right. It started with a notice taped to my front gate. The bold red letters read violation, unauthorized structure, and encroachment. Beneath that, in smaller print, was the signature of Karen Blake. The date was that very morning. I laughed out loud. She hadn't even learned her lesson. The cabin, sitting on land legally registered outside the HOA boundary, couldn't possibly fall under their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop her. Attached to the paper was a demand for immediate inspection and a warning of potential fines and property seizure. That last line made my blood run cold. Property seizure. That wasn't just arrogance, it was a threat. I took a photo of the notice and sent it to Benson with a short message. She's at it again. He replied within an hour. Document everything. Don't engage. I'm sending my legal liaison down tomorrow, so I waited. The next morning, I was on the porch, coffee in hand, when I heard the crunch of tires again. But this time, it wasn't Karen's white SUV. It was a dark sedan with government plates. Out stepped a woman in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and confident, holding a folder and a badge. Mr. Walker, she said, extending a hand. I'm Lauren Hughes, legal liaison from the Attorney General's office. Mr. Benson sent me. We shook hands and I invited her inside. She scanned the cabin, her eyes falling briefly on the old coffee stain from Benson's cup. He told me about the incident, she said. Quite the story. And now this notice. She took the paper from me and examined it. She actually signed this herself. On official HOA letterhead. I nodded. She thinks she's untouchable. Lauren smiled faintly. Good. That kind of confidence usually comes before a collapse. She spent the next few hours taking photos, recording a short statement, and checking the property line markers with the GPS tool. Everything here checks out, she said. This land is definitely outside HOA jurisdiction. Karen's trespassing notice isn't just invalid, it's criminal intimidation. By noon, we were sitting at the cabin table again. Lauren pulled out her laptop and began typing up a summary. We'll forward this to the investigative unit, she said. If she keeps pushing, we'll have grounds for a restraining order and a formal charge. But before she could finish her sentence, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. We exchanged glances. Lauren closed her laptop and stood. I followed her to the door, and there she was against Karen Blake, standing on my porch like she owned it. Only this time, she wasn't alone. 2 men in neon safety vests stood behind her, holding clipboards and measuring tapes. Good morning, Mr. Walker, she said, her tone overly sweet. We're here to conduct the inspection you ignored. I stepped forward, blocking the doorway. You're trespassing again, Karen. She ignored me and gestured toward the men. Gentlemen, please measure the deck area and note the extension on the rear wall. Lauren stepped out beside me, flashing her badge. Stop right there, she said. Lauren Hughes, State Attorney General's office. You are interfering with an active state investigation. Karen blinked, her smile faltering. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. We're simply doing a community compliance check. On private land outside your jurisdiction, Lauren shot back. You were already warned about this. The men behind Karen exchanged nervous looks. One whispered something, then both stepped back toward their truck. Karen turned, glaring at them. Don't you dare leave, they're making the smart choice. Lauren interrupted. You might want to do the same. Karen's face twisted with anger. This is harassment. She shouted. You people don't understand how this community works. I have a duty to protect it from people like him. People like me? I asked quietly. You mean property owners who know their rights? Her voice cracked with frustration. You think you can hide behind lawyers and paperwork, but you're not above the age. Lauren stepped closer, her tone cold and professional. Actually, Ms. Blake, you're not above the law. You've trespassed, issued fraudulent notices, and obstructed a government investigation. I strongly suggest you leave before we add resisting authority to that list. Karen looked at her, then at me, and for a brief second, I saw fear flicker across her face. She turned sharply, muttering under her breath, and stomped toward her SUV. Gravel sprayed behind her as she drove off. Lauren exhaled, shaking her head. That woman's walking straight into a legal disaster. She doesn't know how to stop, I said quietly. Laura nodded. Then we'll stop her. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I watched her car disappear down the valley road. The silence returned, but this time, it felt different, heavier. The lines had been drawn. Karen had waged war not just against me, but against the state itself. And though she didn't realize it yet, she had just handed the Attorney General's office all the proof they needed to take her down for good. The storm had officially arrived. The next week felt like the calm before a courtroom battle. The cabin stayed quiet, but the air around Valley Estates was charged with whispers. Word had started to spread that the state attorney general's office was looking into HOA activities. And though no official notice had been made public yet, people could sense something big was coming. Karen tried to keep the illusion of control, sending out cheerful newsletters about community improvements and routine checks, but everyone knew something was off. The tone in her emails had shifted from bossy confidence to nervous formality. She was still trying to act like the queen, but the cracks in her crown were beginning to show. Meanwhile, Lauren Hughes, the Attorney General's liaison, turned the cabin into a small command center. Every day, she'd arrive with files, folders, and her laptop, connecting to the state network through a satellite link. She was calm and methodical, rarely raising her voice. But the intensity in her eyes told me she was building something powerful, a legal case that would shake the HOA system from its foundation. Karen's not just a local bully, Lauren said one morning, tapping her pen on the table. She's been manipulating financial reports for years. Look at this. She pushed a spreadsheet toward me. Tens of thousands in landscape fees, but no record of actual contractors being paid. I leaned over the papers. So she's been pocketing the money. Part of it, Lauren said. The rest likely went to a shell company she created. We've seen this pattern before in other HOAs under investigation. She's bold but careless. As we spoke, the sound of a car engine echoed up the road again. I froze for a second, but Lauren didn't even flinch. That's not her, she said calmly. That's Benson. Sure enough, the Attorney General himself stepped out of a black SUV, carrying a briefcase. He greeted us with his usual steady smile, though his eyes looked sharper, more focused than before. Good morning, he said. Looks like we've stirred up quite a hornet's nest. Lauren briefed him on the latest findings, the fake fines, the intimidation notices, and the financial trail. Benson listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes. When she finished, he looked at me. How's the community reacting? Scared, I admitted. People want to speak up, but they're afraid of being fined or harassed. Karen's been the law here for too long. He nodded. That ends soon, but we'll need statements, first-hand accounts. Would you be willing to organize a few residents to meet with us? Of course, I said. They'll come. They just need to know it's safe. That evening, I made a few calls to neighbors I trusted. There was Tom, a retired teacher who'd been fined for having unauthorized sunflowers in his yard. Linda, who'd been billed $600 for a fence that never needed repair. And old Mr. Jenkins, whose pension barely covered the HOA's ever-increasing community maintenance fee. Each one of them agreed to meet, after dark, at my cabin. By the next night, the small wooden porch was filled with nervous faces. The glow from the lanterns cast soft light across the room as Benson and Lauren listened carefully to each person's story. Some spoke with anger, others with tears. It wasn't just about money, it was the humiliation, the constant fear, the feeling of being trapped in their own homes. Tom's voice cracked as he spoke. She made me tear down my shed because it was too rustic. I built that with my father 30 years ago. She said it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Linda held up an envelope. I still have the letters she sent. Threats, warnings, all signed by her, and she charged me for repainting a wall that was never touched. Lauren gathered every statement, every document, scanning and filing them with quiet precision. When the last person left, Benson closed his notebook with a sigh. This isn't just about one power-hungry woman, he said. It's about corruption, hiding under the word community. I could see the fire in his eyes now, the kind that came from years of seeing injustice repeat itself. So what happens next? I asked. He stood and looked out the cabin window into the dark forest. Next, he said, we make it official. The next morning, the valley awoke to a scene no one had expected. 3 unmarked cars rolled into Valley Estates, followed by a state van. Investigators in plain clothes began visiting the HOA office, asking for records, contracts, and financial statements. Residents peeked from behind curtains, whispering as men and women with badges walked past. Karen tried to hold her ground. She came out of the office with her usual clipped tone, hands on her hips. "This is harassment," she shouted to anyone who would listen. "The HOA is cooperating fully, but this intrusion is unnecessary." But her voice was shaking. Inside the office, Lauren and Benson sat across from her at the conference table. Karen's confidence seemed to crumble more with every question. When Benson asked about the landscaping invoices, she claimed she didn't recall the contractors. When Lauren presented copies of the altered budgets, she stammered something about clerical errors. Every answer dug her hole deeper. By the time the meeting ended, Karen's hands were trembling. She tried to maintain her smile, but everyone could see it was fake. The state team packed up their files and left, but Benson lingered behind for a moment. "Ms. Blake," he said quietly, "I suggest you cooperate fully from this point forward. The alternative won't be pleasant." She didn't respond, just stared at him with cold, furious eyes. That evening, I received a short call from Lauren. "We've got enough to move forward," she said. "The official investigation begins tomorrow." When I hung up, I stepped outside onto the porch. The valley was peaceful again, the creek, whispering the wind, carrying the scent of pine. But somewhere down the hill, the bright lights of the HOA office still glowed in the dark. And I knew Karen was sitting there, plotting her next move. Because for people like her, the fight never ended, they just got more desperate. And something told me, the storm was far from over. By the end of the week, the news had spread across the valley like wildfire. The state attorney general's office was officially investigating Valley Estates, HOA. Most residents greeted the announcement with cautious relief. For years, they had endured Karen's endless fines, threats, and invasions of privacy, but few ever dared to challenge her. Now, for the first time, they felt the weight of the law shifting in their favor. But if anyone thought Karen would quietly surrender, they didn't know her like I did. She wasn't the kind to accept defeat. She was the kind to dig in and drag everyone down with her. It started with rumors. Whispers spread that I had conspired with the government to take down the HOA. Someone posted an anonymous message on the community board, claiming that I'd forged complaints and exaggerated stories to make the HOA look bad. The post vanished a few hours later, but the damage was done. A few neighbors stopped waving when I passed. One even crossed the street to avoid me. I knew exactly where it came from, Karen's desperate attempt to turn the community against me. Then came the knock on my door. It was late afternoon, the sun barely breaking through the trees, when two men in suits appeared at the cabin. They introduced themselves as private investigators, working with Valley Estates, HOA. I knew right away what that meant. "Mr. Walker," one of them said smoothly, "we're conducting an internal review on behalf of Ms. Blake. She's requested copies of any documents or communications you've shared with state officials." I let out a short laugh. "You're not getting anything from me," I said. The taller man smiled like he expected that answer. "That's unfortunate. Refusal to cooperate could be viewed as obstruction. Save it." I cut him off. "You're trespassing. And for the record, this property isn't HOA land. If you're still here in 30 seconds, you'll be talking to the sheriff." That got their attention. They left without another word, and I called Lauren as soon as they were gone. She arrived at the cabin the next morning, her jaw tight with anger. "She hired private investigators?" she asked, pacing the porch. "That's a violation of multiple state statutes during an active inquiry. She's trying to intimidate you." "That's not news," I said. "It's her favorite hobby." Lauren pulled out her phone. "I'm filing a report right now, and I'll make sure Benson hears about this today." By noon, Benson called personally. His tone was calm, but I could hear the controlled fury beneath it. "She just made the worst mistake of her career," he said. "If she's interfering with a state investigation, we can charge her with obstruction and witness intimidation." Still, I knew Karen wouldn't stop there, and she didn't. Single quotes. 2 days later, residents woke up to find letters slipped under their doors and signed, but clearly her doing. Each one warned that certain individuals in the community were working to dismantle the HOA, and that if the board was dissolved, property values would plummet. It ended with a chilling line: "You have a choice, stand with your HOA, or watch your neighborhood collapse." That night, my phone buzzed nonstop. Tom called first, his voice shaky. "Walker, she's scaring people. Some think the state will seize their homes." "Can that even happen?" "No," I said firmly. "She's bluffing. Tell everyone to stay calm. The state's not taking anything, they're protecting your rights." But Karen's campaign was working. The next HOA meeting drew the biggest crowd in years. Even people who despised her showed up, desperate for answers. I stayed outside at first, listening through the open windows. Karen stood at the front of the room, her voice as sharp as ever. "They want to destroy everything we've built," she cried, pointing dramatically at a stack of state documents. "These so-called investigators are trying to strip away our authority, but I won't let them. We've worked too hard to maintain our standards." A few people clapped. Most stayed silent. Someone finally asked, "But what about the fines, the fake charges?" Karen's face tightened. "Those were administrative errors," she said quickly. "And as for Mr. Walker," she paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. He's the one who started this witch hunt. That was my cue. I stepped through the doorway. The room fell silent. Actually, I said calmly, I didn't start anything. You did. Karen, when you broke into my cabin, when you sent false violations, and when you used fear to control good people. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes narrowed. You don't belong here, Walker, she snapped. You live outside the community. You have no right to speak. Benson's voice echoed from the back of the room. Actually, he said, stepping forward, he has every right, more than you do right now. Karen froze as the state attorney general himself entered, flanked by 2 officials carrying files. We're issuing an immediate suspension of all HOA operations, pending legal review, Benson announced. Effective immediately, Ms. Blake, you are relieved of your duties. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Karen looked around wildly, trying to regain her footing. You can't do this. I'm the elected president. Benson's tone was cool. And you're also under investigation for fraud, misuse of funds, and harassment. He handed her a document. You'll receive a formal notice of charges within 72 hours. Karen stood there, shaking, her mouth open but no words coming out. Then, without another sound, she grabbed her purse and stormed out. The meeting dissolved into chatter, half disbelief, half relief. People turned to each other, hugging, some even crying. It was the first time in years that Valley Estates felt like a community again, not a kingdom ruled by fear. Later that night, I sat on the cabin porch with Benson and Lauren. The crickets sang softly, and the air finally felt light again. It's over, I said quietly. Benson nodded. Almost, but she won't go quietly. People like her never do. He was right. Down in the valley, lights still glowed in Karen's house, long after midnight. And though the papers were signed and the investigation was official, I knew she was planning something. Something desperate. The storm hadn't passed. It was gathering strength for one final strike. The courtroom was packed that morning. It wasn't a small claims case anymore. It had grown into a full-blown scandal that the local news had started calling the Valley Cabin Conflict. HOA members sat nervously in the front row, whispering among themselves, while Karen stood near her attorney, arms folded and lips tight with defiance. I sat quietly behind my own counsel, calm and collected, knowing that everything was about to come to light. At the far end of the room sat the State Attorney General, Thomas Reeves. The man Karen had unknowingly barged in on weeks ago when she stormed into my cabin. His presence alone was enough to make the HOA's lawyers pale. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The silence that followed was thick. My attorney rose and began presenting the evidence, the unauthorized intrusion, the harassment records, and the documentation showing the HOA's misuse of funds. The most shocking part came when Thomas himself took the stand. He testified how he had been meeting with me regarding a state environmental protection project when Karen broke into my cabin, shouting about violations. His calm tone and professional reputation carried undeniable weight. The courtroom's air shifted. Suddenly, Karen wasn't the powerful HOA president anymore. She was just a woman caught trespassing on government business. Karen's attorney tried to defend her, claiming she was acting in good faith to enforce community rules. But her story quickly unraveled. The HOA had been using homeowners' dues to fund private parties and pay for security patrols that didn't exist. Bank statements and emails proved it. Every piece of evidence revealed that Karen had used her position to intimidate and control, not to protect. As her voice cracked on the stand, trying to insist she was protecting neighborhood values, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and pity. Then came the turning point. The judge called for a brief recess. When we reconvened, the judge leaned forward and addressed the courtroom. This is more than a property dispute, he said sternly. This is about power, misuse, and arrogance under the guise of community service. His words echoed in the silent hall. The gavel struck once. The HOA was ordered to cease all operations immediately pending full investigation. Karen was found personally liable for unlawful trespassing and harassment, with restitution to be paid to me and several other residents who had filed complaints. Karen's face turned white. The once confident woman who had strutted into my cabin, like she owned the valley now, looked small and defeated. As she walked out of the courtroom, escorted by officers, she glared at me one last time. But it wasn't anger in her eyes anymore. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone finally realizes they've run out of power. After the hearing, Thomas Reeves approached me outside the courthouse. I have to admit, he said with a faint smile, I didn't expect my cabin visit to turn into a state investigation. I laughed. Neither did I, but I'm glad it did. He placed a hand on my shoulder. You stood your ground. That's rare these days. Don't let anyone take that valley away from you. His words meant more than he knew. The following week, the headlines spread across the state. HOA president found guilty of harassment. State attorney general involved. The entire community turned against Karen and her corrupt board. The HOA was dissolved by a state order, and the valley properties were officially returned to private ownership under new oversight. Residents who once feared Karen's wrath now stopped by my cabin to thank me. Some brought homemade pies. Others offered help restoring the trail she had tried to block off. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the valley hills, I sat on the porch of my cabin. sipping coffee and listening to the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines. The lake shimmered golden, untouched and peaceful. It felt like the valley itself was breathing again, free from the chaos. I thought about how close I'd come to losing this place, not because of legalities, but because of arrogance and greed. Now, everything felt right. Weeks later, Thomas came back to visit. He looked around and said, "You know, this valley could make a great conservation landmark." I smiled, knowing exactly what he meant. Together, we began drafting plans to protect the area permanently, not just for me, but for everyone who loved its quiet beauty. What started as a battle against Karen's control had turned into something far bigger, a restoration of balance and respect for the land. Karen eventually moved out of the county, selling her house quietly and leaving without a word. The H sign at the valley's entrance was taken down, replaced by a simple wooden board that read, "Welcome to Valley Springs. Respect nature, respect each other." That message summed up everything I had learned. As the last light faded, I whispered to myself, power doesn't come from control, it comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard. The valley was mine again, not just by deed, but by peace. For more incredible real-life HOA justice stories, like, share, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, HOA Bright Reality. Stay tuned because in this valley, every story has a reckoning.